introduction. That is the most moving introduction that I've ever heard. It's one of the moving things I've ever heard, period. So many thanks to you, Bill Duino Jr., and to all the members of the Edith Stein Guild, and to Father Moran for celebrating the beautiful Mass today, and to my mother and stepfather's pastor, Father Joe, for celebrating, and to all of you here for coming here in the inner sanctum of one of the most beautiful places on earth. Thank you. So I apologize for using this device. We had a printer error today, so making do here, a little more high tech than usual. My topic is Sponsa Christi, what Edith Stein taught me about the mystery of spiritual motherhood. Before I say anything else, I owe it to the Lord to glorify Him for the amazing things He has done in my life to bring me here. I realize that there may be people here who are not Catholic, perhaps even some who are not theists. But my story shows that, at the very least, if there is a God, He must certainly have a sense of humor. Let me explain by sharing with you an episode from my life that shows how unusual is the path that brought me here to address you today. I was raised Reformed Jewish and was an agnostic from my teens until the age of 31, when I had an encounter with God that led me to seek baptism in a Protestant church. At that time, this was the year 1999, which now makes me 50. And at that time, I did not know what denomination I would ultimately choose, but I did know one thing. I was going to be A, B, C, anything but Catholic. A few years later, in early August 2004, I went on a pilgrimage to England sponsored by the American Gk Chesterton Society. I went because I was a fan of Chesterton and was hoping to learn more about him. What I didn't know until I arrived was that I would be the only Protestant on a tour bus full of Catholics, nearly all of whom saw it as their mission to convert me. I say nearly all because there were also there were 3 priests on the bus, and the priests were all like, "Yeah, she'll come around." But everybody else thought, "This is urgent. This is dire. You've got to bring her in." So on the first full day of the pilgrimage, a sweet church lady approached me and said, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I was raised Jewish, and now I'm a baptized Christian. But yes, in some sense, I will always be Jewish." Then she said, "Have you heard of Edith Stein?" I hadn't. So she explained to me that Stein was a German Jewish woman, a brilliant philosopher who was a trailblazer among women in European academia prior to the Second World War. She converted to Catholicism, became a Carmelite nun, and was ultimately martyred at Auschwitz. I said to the woman, "Yes, Edith Stein does sound like someone I should know about. Thank you for telling me about her." The next day, 2 more of my fellow Gk Chesterton pilgrims, a married couple, approached me. The wife said, "We were wondering, since you're Jewish, if you had ever heard of Edith Stein." And so it went on every day for nearly 2 weeks.
Wow.
I don't think my fellow pilgrims understood how I felt. At some point, I tried to explain it to them. I said, imagine if an African-American man were to walk into a synagogue and the rabbi were to approach him saying, "You're black. Have you ever heard of Sammy Davis?" In any case, by the third or fourth day of the pilgrimage, I was certain of one thing, that I never wanted to hear about Edith Stein again for the rest of my life. All that took place during the first week of August 2004.
Oh my.
Little could I have imagined that exactly 15 years later, I would be here at St. Patrick's Cathedral, a Catholic with a doctorate in sacred theology, licensed by the Holy See, delivering the annual lecture in honor of Edith Stein. So it surely doesn't. And yet, the true irony is that at the very point in my life when I was put off by the thought that Edith Stein could be a model for me, I was in fact following a similar path to hers, and this has to do with particularly with something Father Moran said in his homily, and also with what Bill Duino said. You see, my fellow Chesterton pilgrims thought that since I was a Jew, I was seeking a way of being Christian that would satisfy my Jewish longings. But that's not what I was searching for. I wasn't seeking Jewish truth. I wasn't seeking Catholic truth. And although I was intent on being Protestant, I wasn't even seeking Protestant truth. I was seeking the truth.
Yes.
That's right.
In that desire, I know now that I was far closer to Edith Stein than I realized. But I'll get to that in a few moments. First, I want to tell you why I was seeking the truth. Throughout my childhood, I was extraordinarily literate. My mother is in the front row, and she can tell you I would devour books. My interest in books peaked during 7th grade, when it was not uncommon for me to take out 20 books from the library a week. That was my ritual. I would skim nearly all of them, and the best ones I would read all the way through. And I have to admit, not all of them were great works of literature. For example, I went through a fascination with the occult and paranormal, and also I had to read absolutely everything having anything to do with Monty Python. But entering into high school, I was already acquainted with a number of classic authors ranging from Shakespeare to Salinger, Somerset Maugham. I still don't know how to pronounce them because I only read it when I was 12. Edgar Allan Poe, Bullfinch's Mythology, and I read the poets in the anthologies on my mother's shelves. Also, until I entered high school, I was enrolled in classes for the so-called gifted and talented. Although my grades were so-so, I tested high enough to be classed with the brightest students. But then, something happened. I began to place out of the top-level classes and into the intermediary ones. At the same time, I stopped reading books that weren't required for school, except for unchallenging ones, such as popular encyclopedias of rock and roll music. It's interesting, we heard during the homily that Edith Stein, when she was 14, decided that she wasn't going to pray anymore. And this change happened in me right at the same time. This was also after my bat mitzvah when I became an agnostic. So what caused this change? There are some obvious answers. In high school, I had more required reading and consequently less time to read for pleasure. I also developed obsessions with boys and with rock and roll, and I began to spend my Saturdays in pursuit of both, visiting boutiques in Greenwich Village in hope of making new friends. This was before the village became the shopping mall that it is today. But to say that I simply replaced my love of books with new loves is too simple. Plenty of people who started out as intellectuals remained so even after they entered into the New York City music and dating worlds. Jim Carroll and Patti Smith come to mind. And to be fair, I should note that in ceasing to read intellectually demanding books, I didn't seize all intellectual work. In fact, I began at that time to engage in the research that would eventually, in the 1990s, lead to my becoming a widely published rock and roll historian. I had no problem tracking down facts, analyzing them, and breaking them down for a reading audience. As a rock critic, I also took pleasure in wordsmithing, using written language to convey the feel of the music I loved, and still love. So what really happened to bring my intellectual life, apart from rock journalism, to a halt? Many years went by before I would begin to understand the reason why. I recognize now that the end of my love affair with books coincided with the beginning of my feeling the physical and emotional effects of what would 25 years later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, the effects of trauma that I suffered as a child, including the divorce of my parents and sexual abuse. At that point, high-level literature became my enemy because reading intellectually demanding writing requires the use of memory in a way that popular literature does not. To read something intellectually demanding is to risk learning something that can change one's perspective on one's personal history and relationships. The reader of such literature has to be willing to engage with that literature, both judging it and, when appropriate, letting it judge her. By contrast, popular literature, being superficial in nature, is ideal for the person who wishes to keep her memory segmented into manageable partitions. I could not deal with my memories of trauma and abuse, so I found ways to keep myself interested in words and the arts without having to exercise my mind in ways that would put my emotions at risk. Now, even though, as I say, I did not understand at the time why I stopped reading intellectual books, I knew that something had changed. Something had departed from my life. And I felt this loss. I felt it acutely, as though part of me had died. I've never shared this with anyone, anywhere. In fact, this is the first time my mother, who's here, is even hearing this. But one of my outstanding memories of my final years as an undergraduate at New York University, where I lived at Weinstein Dorm, just off Washington Square Park. One of my outstanding memories is of pacing the aisles of Posman Books, which was then at One University Place at the corner of Waverly. Posman was known for carrying a fine selection of classic literature and academic books. It was open late, and I recall that in the evenings, when I was bored and lonely, I would browse, going up and down every aisle, thinking that somewhere in that shop was a work of literature or a high-level nonfiction book that would bring me back to serious reading. It was like looking for a boyfriend, only for a book. And this reminds me of something which is too good not to share, that Alice von Hildebrand says that when she was maybe 4 or 5 years old, Bill knows this, he's heard her tell this story to us as well. When she was 4 or 5 years old, she said to her mother, "Mother, I don't understand why when a boy wants to marry a girl, he gives her a ring. Why doesn't he give her a book?" and Alice von Hildebrand adds that her mother was duly scandalized by what is going to become of my daughter. Well, that was how I was as a child too, as my mother can attest. So here I was now, age 19, 20, in Poznan, and looking for a book as though I was looking for a boyfriend. And I recall that I would pick up a book that looked like it might be interesting. Perhaps A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, because I'd heard that title before. And I would scan the back cover of the book and then put it down because it didn't seem quite right. I was afraid that once I bought it and started reading, I would become bored and unable to finish it. After 20 minutes or so of searching, I would leave Poznan and return to my dorm room feeling bereft. I felt that given the reader I had been in childhood, I should be able to read and enjoy practically any book in the store. The fact that I couldn't bring myself to buy a single one frustrated me and added to the sense that there was a part of me that was irretrievably gone. It was around that same time that I met and took up to my dorm room a brainy young man who, to hear him tell it at least, was a former child prodigy, a kind of savant who was part of Andy Warhol's circle at the factory. He only wanted conversation, which was fine with me. I was interested in his stories. But I recall that he looked at my bookshelf, singular, in my dorm room, and he said, "That's it?" There is a certain rule of the spiritual life to the effect that God uses the things that once caused us pain in some way in order to heal us. Edith Stein, writing as Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, alludes to this in one of her poems, Juxta Cruce Tecum Stare, to stand with you near the cross. This is what 8 years of graduate Catholic education gets you. You can pronounce Latin because it's been drilled into you. in Juxta Cruce Tecum Stare, Edith Stein describes how Mary, who in giving birth to Jesus was miraculously preserved from pain and bloodshed, yet experienced pain and spiritual wounds as she stood beside the cross. That was when she had the pains of childbirth as the mother of the church, as she was participating with her prayers in her son's redemption of the world. I experienced that in my own spiritual life, that experience of God using what had caused me pain to bring me healing, as God, in his mercy, began to use books, the things that I was scared of reading, these high-level books. not only to draw me into his truth, but also ultimately, and this took years, to heal me of my fear that I had of giving myself over to high-level intellectual work. I remember, the moment that this first began. It was in December 1995. This is a story that I tell in my memoir. I was doing a telephone interview with a rock and roll musician named Ben Eschbach. He was a member of a band called The Sugar Plastic, and I still had that longing to that kind of memory of being a reader. And so I asked Ben what was he reading nowadays, which is not a question that one normally asks someone when one's interviewing a member of a rock band about his new album. And he answered that he was reading this book which I'd never heard of, and it was by an author I had never heard of. So afterwards, I went to my local bookstore. For the younger of you here, there was a time when every town, every neighborhood had a bookstore. And amazingly, they actually had on their shelf this book that had been recommended to me. So I took it home and started reading it, simply thinking that I would be able to have something more to talk about with this musician, with Ben, when he came to town. The book was a novel called The Man Who Was Thursday by Gk Chesterton. And in my memoir, I go into some detail about how that book affected me and why. It affected me on many levels. I don't believe I would have read it if I had thoroughly understood before reading it the importance that Chesterton had in the Christian world. In some sense, I started to like it right away because it reminded me of the great reading that I had done as a child, because Chesterton draws liberally from Lewis Carroll in that book, and I had always loved the Alice book. So there was that love of the absurd, but then in the midst of absurd things, he has this remarkable truth. There's this dialogue between two poets, one of whom is a poet of anarchy, as he claims, and the other, who's a stand-in for Chesterton, calls himself a poet of law and order, and the poet of anarchy is saying things like, wouldn't it be great if you could get on a train one stop from Victoria Station and the next stop isn't Victoria, it's some other place, and that's poetry. And the poet of law and order is saying, no, poetry isn't about things going wrong. Poetry is about things going right. And that interested me because I had never heard of that before. I'd never heard of someone trying to argue that human creativity was ultimately about bringing us to a place of interior order and fulfillment. And then there was this line where this poet of law and order said, the most poetical thing in the world is not being sick. At that time, I was on 2 or 3 different medications for what was then misdiagnosed as cyclical suicidal depression. It would be years until I received the accurate diagnosis of PTSD. And I remember that line, the most poetical thing in the world is not being sick jumping out at me, because I knew that there was something wrong with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be feeling interior pain, wanting to cut myself, at times wanting to kill myself, and I wouldn't need to be on these different medications. I wouldn't need to keep a brave and happy face to the world, so that even my closest friends weren't aware of just how often I thought of harming myself. I knew that inside, I truly wanted to know the poetry of not being sick. I wanted to have that interior order. So that brought me to start reading Chesterton. And it took me 5 years of reading Chesterton before I could even really begin to have a desire to read Christian literature, because Chesterton was just so creative and thought-provoking, and nothing that I knew as an outsider to Christian culture, especially contemporary Christian culture as it was embodied at that time in the moral majority, and in what has since been criticized, certainly by evangelicals, as a certain anti-intellectualism that was prevalent at that time, and that parts of Christian life are still fighting that anti-intellectualism. I had no idea that there were contemporary Christians who were like Chesterton and who could really appreciate him as I appreciated him. And this was before it became easy to buy things on the internet. I would have to try to track down Chesterton books in old, used bookstores. So I was like convinced that there were like only 5 people who were actually buying these books, and I was one of them. And in my memoir, I actually speak about during this period of my life going to England to spend 2 weeks with an editor of a rock encyclopedia who was talking about marrying me, and so we were trying to spend 2 weeks in the same place to see if we could get along well enough to take our relationship further. And I remember that even as he and I went to concerts and went to a place called Helter Skelter that was a bookstore just for rock and roll books, I remember that at one point this boyfriend, Colin, took me to this place under a bridge in London where there were these used booksellers. And I asked, "Do you have Chesterton?" I went to the spot where I could find something by Chesterton. I found a copy of his then out-of-print novel, The Flying In, and I was so excited to find this Chesterton, even in the midst of living a lifestyle that, in retrospect, was in many ways lost. I'm not judging myself lost in terms of perdition, but just simply lost in terms of directionless. God was starting to give me direction through reawakening this love of literature through Chesterton. And ultimately, in a story that I don't have time to tell at the moment, but that I've told elsewhere in my book and on 2 episodes of Marcus Grodi's The Journey Home, which you can watch on YouTube. Ultimately, I was led by God's grace, first to baptism and being ABC, and then with the help of the intercession of St. Maximilian Kolbe into the fullness of communion with the Catholic Church, membership in the Church. And I remember that as a new Catholic, one of the things that I was really wanting to know was, what does it mean to be a woman in Christ? what does it mean to be a Christian woman, a Catholic woman? What does it mean to be created a woman? I certainly had ideas from before my Christian life about womanhood, and these ranged from the oppositional brand of feminism. Certainly, feminism is diverse, and not every brand of feminism aims at trying to best men. But I knew about that. I knew about the pagan understanding with respect to women's value being in being sexually alluring. But these things did not seem to me to be fundamentally Christian things. At the same time, reading the literature of that time, this was a time of the sort of heyday of purity literature. As a new Christian and new Catholic, I would read these books that claimed to explain John Paul's theology of the body, or articles that even claimed to explain Edith Stein or von Balthasar and women. But in trying to explain these high-level theological concepts, they would often just boil things down too much to the point where they became kind of sloganeering. So, I'd read these Christian articles about how women are supposed to be actively receptive, and it's like, what does that even mean? I don't know. And then even reading Alice von Hildebrand's The Privilege of Being a Woman, which is a great book and which I recommend, I had difficulties. I give Alice von Hildebrand great credit because when I explained to her the difficulties that I had with the book after reading it, when I had the blessing of becoming friends with her, she actually agreed with me that the problem I had was a problem that she regretted about the book. Namely, that in this book, whereas Alice von Hildebrand speaks about woman's grace as being that she has both physically and in her inner life a kind of a sexuality that is veiled, and that woman has this gift of being able to veil and protect what is sacred, so as to bring it to the world in a way that the world can appreciate the sacred with reverence. I mean, this is only part of her message. For myself, as a victim of abuse, just beginning to come to terms with my abuse, I read this feeling that my veil had been torn away from me without even my willing it. So I read her and other purity authors. I shouldn't class her with purity authors, she's far above them. But I read her and certain other Christian authors in a way that made me feel as though there was no hope for me to experience true womanhood, because I felt wrongly that I had been soiled by abuse. In fact, and I've talked about this at great length in two of my books on healing from trauma. My piece, especially my piece I give you, Healing Sexual Wounds with the Help of the Saints, I know now that abuse never soils the victim. And it's the teachings of the church that Christ stands with the victims. This is something John Paul said, but it goes back to Jesus' own words and Augustine. But in search of what it meant to be a true woman, I read John Paul II's letter on the dignity and vocation of women, Mulieris Dignitatem, and I also, at the recommendation of a priest, read Edith Stein's essays on women. So this was in late 2007, early 2008, before I began graduate studies. This was when I was a journalist and had no intention at that time to become a professor. I had just written my first book, The Thrill of the Chaste. I thought I'd be a chastity speaker, popular author, and so on. So, here's the funny thing. So I read Mulieris Dignitatem and Woman at the same time. And Woman, I half read, I half skimmed, because Edith Stein's writing was on such a high level that I had trouble giving myself over to it. And this was that same problem that I had had in childhood. I had that kind of frustration, even then, even as a Catholic, where I can't read this the way I want to read it, and I don't know why. It was that kind of fear of intellectually engaging myself in a way that might in some way bring flashbacks or bring up bad memories. But here's the funny thing. I must have gotten something substantial out of Stein's Woman, because afterwards I would give chastity talks where I would talk about the message of Mulieris Dignitatem, and I would say, it says somewhere in that, and I'll tell you what it is in a moment, but as I would say this thing that I thought it said somewhere in Mulieris Dignitatem, I would then go back and read the encyclical, and I'd be like, it doesn't say this in so many words. It kind of gives the feel for what I was thinking, but it doesn't say it. So, where did I get it? Am I just so brilliant that I understand John Paul's thoughts so deeply that I can have this sort of graced, infused knowledge of what Jean Paul really means? It's only been just this year in opening Edith Stein's essays on woman again and reading it that I see that everything I thought was in Jean Paul, it is under the surface in Jean Paul, but it's explicit in Edith Stein. And Jean Paul, in writing Mulieris Dignitatem, had in the background very strongly Edith Stein's theology, as is shown by the many times elsewhere where he spoke about her philosophy and theology of woman. So here's what I got out of actually Edith Stein that I would say in talks, and that really helped me. And it was that the essence of true femininity is not in being alluring, neither is it in being actively receptive or in veiling, even though I have a beautiful veil which my mother and stepfather gave me, which I was very happy to wear today at Mass. But even that is not the essence of what it means to be a woman. The essence, the truth about being a woman is related to true masculinity, in that our sexual identity is grounded in creation. It's grounded in God's desire that my soul be the soul of a woman, and the body developing under the guidance of the soul. And likewise, the essence of masculinity is in God's providence, that a person be born a man and develop as a man, and so it's really the essence of our sexuality is grounded in our virtue. Virtue is being the person we were created to be, as Archbishop Sheen says, the soon-to-be blessed Archbishop Sheen, whose spirit is still here, even if his body is no longer. He speaks about how Mary is the only human person, keeping in mind that Jesus is a divine person. Mary is the only human person who ever perfectly matched the blueprint that God had for her. And so being truly feminine is, for me, as a woman, to truly match the blueprint that God has for me. And this does relate to Mulieris Dignitatem. This is where I kind of conflated John Paul and Edith Stein, because John Paul says in Mulieris Dignitatem that true femininity, as in true masculinity is grounded in the order of love. And so I am most feminine when I love, because ultimately I can only love as a woman. I don't love my mother and my stepfather and my other and my dad. I don't love them as their son. I love them as their daughter, and likewise I love my sister as her sister. And the more I love, the more of a woman I truly am, loving in each relationship according to what's appropriate for that relationship, and loving as fully as God gives me the grace and natural abilities to love. So, getting this kind of grounding fairly soon after becoming Catholic, because I became Catholic in 2006, and I read Stein in 2007, 2008. It then provided me with an understanding that took me into this new stage of life as I began graduate study. As I tell in my memoir, I didn't originally set out to become a professor. I went to grad school because I had a health scare. At the end of 2007, I was diagnosed with a suspicious lump on my thyroid that proved to be cancerous. And so in 2008, I had to have 2 operations, one to remove the lump, and the other ultimately once it was proven to be cancerous, I had to have the rest of my thyroid removed. And so I went to school in theology, just thinking that since it was unclear whether I'd still have the constitution to be able to be a touring speaker on chastity, I should have some career, maybe working in campus ministry, where I could at least have health care, have a regular income. It was at that time that I came under the mentorship of a wonderful Jesuit. I know there's at least one person here who remembers him. My vision's not that good. Maria, there you are. Father Francis Canavan of Fordham. And I sent Father Canavan the very first paper that I wrote for my theological studies at the Dominican House of Studies, where I began studying. And when he received it, he called me. He was 91 at the time, or almost 91, and he called me and he told me I couldn't stop at a master's degree. I had to continue to a doctorate. And at that time, although I was enjoying studying, I wasn't completely giving myself over to studying, because I thought, I'm just here for 2 years and that's it. I love the classes, they're great, but I'm never going to become a Dominican. I was in class with mostly Dominicans, and I thought, I'm never going to become an academic or, brilliant scholar, and so I'll just, do this and give to the church, do my master's and give back to the church the best I can. But Father Canavan said, no, I absolutely had to get a doctoral degree, because he said that after the Second Vatican Council, there was a decrease in the number of theologians who taught what the church actually believes. And he said that in coming years, there would be a need for theologians who thought with the church. He said this was a true vocation, and when a Jesuit tells you that something is your true vocation, you need to kind of listen up. So I kept telling him I don't have the mental power, I don't have the brain power to do a doctorate. I'm not smart enough. I have aunts and uncles who have doctorates. That gene did not get passed to me. And he insisted, to the point where I finally said to him, okay, Father Canavan, I will try to get a doctorate. And then he was happy. Then he stopped calling me and bugging me about it. And that was one of my last conversations with him. because he died six weeks later. He went to the Lord, and so I kept pushing in my studies, and this is where I came into the process of just having to, once I was seriously going to try to be a doctor of sacred theology, I had to apply myself in ways that I hadn't applied myself before, and I had to address head-on my fear of giving myself over to intellectual work. I remember I used to have flashbacks in school. I talk about this in my piece I give you, especially in history class, where in history class you can't simply compartmentalize things. You can't simply say, 1528, 1541, or whatever. You have to say, in this year, the Council of Trent, and these are the things they discussed there, and this was the outcome of the discussion. So you have to think in history class on so many different levels and make connections. And as I was making these connections, I would have to actually, save up my tears for the end of class and then go cry. Finally, there was a moment when everything came to a head, and that was when I was in a cafe at the library of Georgetown University, and I would go to Georgetown to do my studying because, in part, being around all the younger students, I thought that would inspire me to keep going so that one day I could teach them the Catholic theology that perhaps they weren't getting quite so much of at Georgetown. One day though, one day, and I've many Jesuit. I'm blessed to have many Jesuit friends who are in their 30s, and I'm counting on them to persevere so that by the time I'm 75, I can retire as a professor at Georgetown because they'll be able to squeeze me in. So I was sitting in the cafe and I was reading Aquinas for my Creation and the Human Person class, and I think it was on Aquinas on the problem of evil, and it was one of those questions in the Summa where there were all these metaphysical distinctions being made. And this was the sort of thing that my Dominican classmates could just do with their engineering brains, and I had great difficulty with. And I remember that as I was trying to understand this, I just broke. I just started, crying in front of, everybody there. Thankfully, college students aren't staring at, the old lady sitting with her Summa. So I was able to just sit there with the book and kind of hide behind my large book. And as I was crying, I just said, Dear God, I am not going to be able to retain every single thing here. I know I'm already forgetting things that I learned in my moral theology class last semester. I'm never going to be like these Dominicans who can memorize every detail of what's in the Summa. So I said, God, if you want me to keep doing this and to keep studying, then you have to just change me by what I'm studying, so that even if I don't remember every detail, I am somehow formed and shaped in my mind so that I become someone who is learned, and who is learned just the way you want me to be learned. So, it hit me that, perhaps what I was trying to be was not the way that God wanted me to be. And there was a way that he wanted me to learn and to be inwardly changed, inwardly shaped by what I was learning. And that that was what I was giving myself over to. I wasn't really giving myself over to the Eucharist heals a man in as much as it unites him with Christus Passus, which is tertia pars, question 73, article 3, response 3. You can look it up. But that's not necessarily what was most important for God. What was most important for God was that even if I couldn't remember the article number, that I understood the truth, and that my mind was shaped and conformed and changed by this truth.
Amen.
And once I realized that, it was like passing through a kind of a gate. I remember also that time that even my dreams changed, because I used to have dreams for many years. The recurring dream of trying to fly and hitting and finding myself blocked by telephone wires and not being able to get through, and being like really scared that if I tried to go through the telephone wires, I'd just be cut up like with barbed wire. It was right around that time that I started in those dreams to just think, I'm gonna aim for the center of that telephone wire, and I'm gonna fly straight through it. And I flew straight through it, and nothing happened. There were more wires, and I had to fly through them, but I wasn't cut up, I wasn't hurt, I just kept flying. And it's been just this year, really, as I've reacquainted myself with women and read up more about Edith Stein, gone deeper, that I've begun, to see how Edith Stein embodied this very mentality. She said, and it's interesting because this came to her when she was reading Aquinas as well, around 1928 or a little earlier. She wrote a letter to a sister. This is when she was still living in the world, and she wrote about how she had this kind of epiphany at a time when she was an academic doing a translation of Thomas Aquinas's De Veritate, his disputed questions on truth, appropriately enough. And she wrote that it was while working on that translation that she realized that these are her words, rather. She realized it is possible to worship God by doing scholarly research. Imagine that. It is possible to worship God by doing scholarly research. That's the insight that she had when translating Aquinas. And she went on to explain, immediately before and for a good while after my conversion, I was of the opinion that to lead a religious life meant one had to give up all that was secular and to live totally immersed in thoughts of the divine. But gradually, I realized that something else is asked of us in this world, and that even in the contemplative life, which she was hungering for at that point, she wanted to be a contemplative, and her spiritual director, Eric Prisvera, S.J., said to her, "No, we need you in the world." But she says, I realized that something else is asked of us in this world, and that even in the contemplative life, one may not sever the connection with the world. I even believe that the deeper one is drawn into God, the more one must go out of oneself. That is, one must go to the world in order to carry the divine life into it. So, when I read words like that, it really does make me feel that that Edith Stein has in some way had her motherly eye on me and been praying for me for a long time. And it makes me so thankful. Just to have a few more minutes, about 5 more minutes, and then time for questions and answers, I think, right? I want to say a few things more specifically about the topic of this talk, which is Sponsa Christi, being a spouse of Christ, and the mystery of spiritual motherhood in Edith Stein. Because one of the things that happened for me as I was undertaking my theological studies was that I felt called to dedicate my celibacy to Jesus' immaculate, rather to Jesus, it is immaculate, but his sacred heart through Mary's immaculate heart. And that made me more interested in learning about spiritual motherhood, because I had a dream in which Father Ed Dowling, S.J., who's a Jesuit I never knew, who was a friend, literally a friend of Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Father Dowling told me in this dream that the time of my life had come when I had to study the chapter on the mystery of spiritual motherhood. And that was how he put it, and I'd never heard of that phrase before. I woke up from the dream and started to research that and found that Paul VI in Marialis Cultus speaks about all the mysteries being connected of Jesus' life being connected to Mary. And from then, my spirituality became more Marian, as was Edith Stein's. And Edith, when I revisited her book on woman, I found quite a bit about spiritual motherhood. And what she says is that first of all, it's the fundamental Christian vocation to be spouse of Christ. The entire church as a whole is bride of Christ, and every man, every woman is called to experience this bridal love. She says, Edith Stein writes that I believe that bridal love in man or in woman is the foundation of surrender to the Lord, wherever it is purely and freely observed. And Edith Stein emphasized that this bridal love is called people in every vocation, whether they're married or single or consecrated. And she speaks of spiritual motherhood in language that I want to share with you, because she speaks of it with relation to maturity, and specifically she speaks of a woman's vocation. I want to try to find this exact quote, but if I can't find it, I'll give you my own memory of it. Let's see if I can just get to it here. It's about maturity. I'm going to make one last effort to find the exact quote, and otherwise I will simply summarize it for you. Okay. What she says is that I found it. She speaks first about this feminine yearning to become mature oneself, and then she says the deepest feminine yearning is to achieve a loving union which in its development validates this maturation and simultaneously stimulates and furthers the desire for perfection in others. This yearning can express itself in the most diverse forms, and some of these forms may appear distorted, even degenerate. Yet, she says, such yearning is an essential aspect of the eternal destiny of woman. It is not simply a human longing, but is specifically feminine and opposed to the specifically masculine nature. So what is specifically feminine is to be a mature person who has a longing to bring others to maturity and, under the influence of grace, true maturity in Christ. That for me is the essence of the mystery of spiritual motherhood. One final thing, and this is especially for anyone who's a member of the Edith Stein Guild who wants to, since its lectures only once a year, anyone who wants to get one little nugget of Edith Stein that they can take with them through the whole year, maybe something you haven't heard anyone say before. If you have heard anyone say this before, then I ask for you to please tell me afterwards. I think this is original to me. Does anyone here, any Edith Stein fan, admirer, know on what occasion did she say, secretum meum mihi, my secret is mine? Anyone knows? My secret is mine? Oh, okay. Well, you know? Okay. So when Edith Stein made the decision to become Catholic, her Protestant friend who would become, under a special dispensation, her godmother, Hedwig Martius, asked her, why do you want to become Catholic? And she answered, I think even writing down on a piece of paper, secretum meum mihi, my secret is mine. And there have been writings trying to analyze this. The general feeling is that she's taking this phrase from, it's actually originally in the Vulgate version of Isaiah at one point in chapter 24, but it's also something said by Cardinal Newman, and before him Bernard of Clairvaux. It has to do with the idea that God speaks secretly to the soul, and that the way that God communicates with the soul can't be understood fully by any other soul. And I think that very likely is the primary meaning of what Stein intended to convey by that. But I think there's another meaning, and this is what I haven't read anywhere. I would like to see if anyone else has talked about this. The Latin word secretum, in secret, doesn't just come from the word that we would have for the English secret. It also can be a perfect passive participle for secrevi, which is to divide, to pull, like put asunder. And we sort of use the word secret in that meaning when we speak of someone saying that he secreted away his baseball card collection or something, like he separated it, secreted it away. That's the other meaning. So secretum meum mihi can mean my secret is mine, but it can also mean my being pulled apart, set apart is mine. My act of being divided is mine. Because as those of us who know Edith Stein's story are aware, her conversion separated her from the one human being she loved most in the world, her mother. It separated her from a kind of conscious or overt friendship with the Jewish people, even though in her heart she was never closer to the Jewish people. But human relationships changed for her. And this is also part of spiritual motherhood. Spiritual motherhood is being able to be a parent when it hurts, to love others and bring out the best in others, even when it hurts and even when it causes feelings of being torn within. Edith Stein lived that mystery of spiritual motherhood as well, and if we wish to emulate her as men and women of the church, we need to ask God to give us that spiritual parenthood and that fortitude to remain, as she was, faithful men and women of the church under Peter, praying for and longing for the union of all in Christ. Thank you so much. God bless you.